Are high as Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana prepares to deliver the medium-term budget policy statement on Wednesday. As usual, the Democratic Alliance has its own version. Let's bring in DA MP Dion George for more analysis on what we can expect from the medium-term budget statement. With austerity a big possibility, what else can Treasury do to mitigate the high cost of living in South Africa? Thank you so much, DA Shadow Minister for Finance, Dion George, for speaking to us here on eNCA Newsnight. Let's just talk quickly about the 5 core principles in the DA's alternative medium-term budget policy. Can you tell us roughly what they are?
Well, we're focusing on 5 core policy issues. Firstly, that we need economic growth in our country that will generate jobs. That's very important. Also, we need to address the energy crisis. The rolling blackouts are hurting business very much, and that is why our economy is not growing, and that's why we have a revenue shortfall, and that's also driving up inflation, and that's what's also driving food off the table of battling South Africans. Then thirdly, we need the minister to explain what he's going to be doing about the spiraling debt and also where expenditure cuts are actually going to take place and how they're going to work, because government wants to cut in the wrong places, and that's going to cause problems for our economy. And then very, very importantly is how government is going to support vulnerable South Africans who are battling to put enough food on the table. 41% of households are not able to put enough food on the table. And that's unacceptable in a country that is actually a rich one, such as ours. And then the 5th policy that we're looking at is bolstering corruption-busting institutions, because we were grey listed in February, as everybody knows. And if you do not resolve the grey listing, it means that it's going to get in the way of our foreign direct investment. It already has done that. So we need to create a economic ecosystem that is conducive to economic growth. And the only way to do that is to focus on the areas where government is not actually performing as it should. And that's in most of the areas of our economy, unfortunately. But fundamentally, as government needs to demonstrate that it actually cares about the plight of battling South Africans. It's done nothing. It's been sitting on its hands, and that is not acceptable. And so we want to know from the minister on Wednesday, what is he going to be doing about that?
Okay, so you released a document sort of detailing those 5 core principles. They're sort of general, broad brushstrokes. You talked there a little bit about cuts to government spending, and you're saying government's doing that in the wrong places. Where would the DA do those cuts? On what? How much? For how long? As a counterpoint to what you think the current government is doing wrong?
Well, government needs to look at the model of our economy. So, for example, the state-owned enterprises. We know that model does not work. Government has been pouring hundreds of billions of rands into the state-owned enterprises, and they are still bankrupt, and they will never, ever be viable. So government needs to stop spending money on that, allow the private sector to become part of that, inject efficiency into it and private sector money. And that would mean that it would cut down expenditure significantly. And it would not need to cut in places that aren't going to make any difference in any event. So that's the one key policy area that it needs to cut in. And also the public sector wage bill. We know that there are many millionaire managers who are deployed cadres in government that are adding no value whatsoever, providing no service, but are earning substantial salaries. And that bloated salary bill is putting enormous pressure on our fiscal situation. So if government focused on cutting in those areas, and then also the other wasteful places, for example, like the VIP protection for politicians, that it's just a vanity project, they don't need that protection. So that's where government needs to cut. And that would mean then, if it cut there, it would have enough money, more than enough money, to actually provide relief for battling South African households. So we've proposed that we could cut VAT on more of the items in the food basket. And that's what will make a real difference to South Africans, because the state-owned enterprises aren't, and the bloated public sector isn't doing that. So the government needs to do that. And it needs to do it pretty quickly, because we've got a revenue shortfall, because our economy has not grown as projected in February because of the rolling blackouts. So government is in a very difficult position. It's not getting the revenue that it projected it was going to get, even though it projected a very tepid growth. It's not going to even get that revenue. And so by the end of the year, several departments will already run out of money. So the unfortunate fact is that government has run out of money and it's got nowhere to go. And that is why it's talking about raiding the Reserve Bank of its reserves to fill the gap, because it thinks there's no other way to do it. Because it can tax, which certainly the people cannot tolerate because there's no space for that. It can borrow more money, but that's already crowding out service delivery and it needs to be paid back. And then, of course, it can cut. So the real thing that we need to be doing is to grow the economy. And we can have an economic growth if government just got out of the way. It's positioned at the center of our economy, but it is incompetent, it is incapable, and it is corrupt. And so if they just got out of the way and let the private sector get on with it, then we would see an uptick already. And that's what needs to happen. So government needs to fundamentally change that. We need to attract foreign direct investment, and that means we need to get ourselves off the grey list as soon as possible by doing the things that are required, because that's where we can generate the jobs. Because 41% of South African households are unable to put enough food on the table. Now, in a country that's actually a rich one, it's not acceptable. It really is not acceptable. And so our question to the minister is, well, you must demonstrate to the South African people that government actually does care about the cost of living crisis, because everybody goes to the supermarket and the prices keep going up. Why? It's because government the lights are off, so business doesn't operate properly. The supply chain becomes more expensive, and so the spiral just keeps going. So, and then
Dr. George, I want to check in with you what you made of President Cyril Ramaphosa's speech this evening. In that speech, he listed a number of government successes and outlining once again the plans to tackle the challenges, the ongoing challenges, load shedding being one of them. And President Ramaphosa saying we've made significant strides in reducing load shedding. And it seemed that was sort of celebrated in that speech as a bit of a victory. Would you say that that's where we are?
Well, look, we're all very, very excited about the Springbok victory because it certainly gives us hope. And it's wonderful to see the opportunities in our country. We really are a great country in the making. But the president made a political speech when they really had nothing to do with the Springbok success. Because if you look at the state of the sports South Africa, I mean, you know, there's no value add there. So government can't actually own that. But of course, we all own it as South Africans, and we're all delighted that we've made this wonderful, wonderful win that's history making. It's really, really great. But government cannot claim any economic successes, unfortunately. Our economy is not growing as our counterpart countries are post-pandemic, because government has got in the way of that. So also, we've had load shedding for how long has it now been? 15 years? And we're still working on the problem? Well, you know, the DA's model is very different. What we can do is we can inject private sector capital into Eskom, for example, and into other state-owned enterprises. We can get more private sector electricity generated very easily into the grid if government allowed that to happen. But it doesn't do that because it sits in the center of the economy and wants to control it when it is incompetent and incapable and corrupt. So the president cannot claim economic victory. You certainly can't do that when more and more South Africans are actually going to bed hungry every night. That's the rub. So what the president and what the Minister of Finance needs to tell South Africans is how they're going to fix that problem. Celebrating a reduction in blackouts is no celebration at all. The lights should not be off, certainly not after 15 years of the problem starting. It means that government actually doesn't have a plan and wants to cut in the wrong places as well. That's a problem. And then it also wants to now fill the gap by raiding the Reserve Bank. Now that really smacks of desperation. So the government has a lot of explaining to do. And that is why they try to jump onto the success of our Springboks, is to, oh, well, let's celebrate a few good things here on the back of a victory of our rugby team. who actually
no doubt
succeed
South Africans
despite
are
the
all going to be keeping their eyes on that medium-term budget statement as it affects all of us very directly. We do thank you for your insights. That was Dr. Dion George, DA Shadow Minister of Finance, talking to us there in the build-up to that medium-term budget statement and in the wake of President Cyril Ramaphosa's speech to the nation this evening.